All right, so before I get started here with a video action that I'll show you on the existence of moral good and evil, I want to say something before you worry about taking notes or anything. And it doesn't have anything directly to do with this course, but it's going to help me explain why I need you guys to have your A game on, right? I want this to be a course and a semester with dialogue and exchange. And you're not going to do that just by taking, what you think are essential notes without understanding the material and being able to give back. When I use the word abstract, like if I say this is abstract or abstraction, what do you think of? Like what does that word mean to you? If I say something's abstract.
It has like different ways to it.
Different ways to it, What else? Anybody else? Could mean it's a little hard to comprehend, something like that. In theology and in philosophy, we don't use the word abstract in the same way. The word abstract means that I can separate one part of something, not a part, but a characteristic of something from where it exists. Let me say it this way. If I were to tell you, picture in your mind a red rose. Now, can you picture red separate from the rose? That's a unique human quality. That's called abstraction. If I tell you, picture a horn and picture a horse. Now, can you place that horn on the horse, like in the image of a unicorn? That's an abstraction, okay? There are three, what they call the highest abstracted sciences. Physics, what we're talking about, like the physical sciences, mathematics, and theology/metaphysics, all right? So what happens is in physics, you study abstract concepts, but in terms of motion and change, right? In mathematics, it is abstract, but it's in terms of quantity and extension. When it comes to what we're studying, it's literally only in terms of being. So what does that mean? Because I know that sounds odd. This is what I'm going with this, for my simple point, is that sometimes people will find this difficult. You can't measure it. We can't put formulas to it to determine how things accelerate. So you're going to have to keep a lot of principles and ideas in your heads and apply it here. Not everybody does a good job at that, all right? So it's going to take a deeper level of concentration on your point. We're really going to get into ideas and concepts, but unless you can grasp them, it's going to be hard for us to communicate. Now, how do you know that on a practical level? Let me tell you something. If you were in a car accident and it was your fault and the person was going to sue you, you would go and get a lawyer. And then the lawyer would represent you and your rights and to make sure that everything was done, at least within the limits of the law. Do you think if you did that, you would consider yourself not thinking for yourself? Like if you knew somebody who had to get a lawyer to represent them, would you tell them, why do you need a lawyer for? You can't think for yourself? Why do you need a lawyer to tell you what to do? You would find that even an odd statement, right? Because you would understand that lawyer to be an expert in his field more so than you could have gained on knowledge you've gained on your own. Yes. Now, what is my point then with theology? If somebody were to say to you when it comes to judgments and moral behavior and such, well, I rely on the church to help guide me in that. All of a sudden, you're probably thinking in yourself, well, what, they can't think for themselves? They have to follow the church? Like my mother is a very deep, pious person. She's also very submissive. She would submit to the church on most things. Now that may make somebody think that she herself is not coming to their own conclusions, therefore she's not thinking for herself. But the church has well over 15, 16, 1700 years of practice and understanding and comprehension in this. Why is it any different than if we were to choose a lawyer or call a plumber or call a doctor and rely on their expertise? All right? I want you to look at that in those terms. But I also want you to be more engaged, okay? So I'm going to need your full participation here. This is going to be a little more abstract than sacraments. I was going to say sacramental theology that we did last quarter and the last 2 quarters. So if you struggle through that, it's not that this is harder, it's just different. And you need to be fully engaged, all right? Now, that being said, one last thing before I get started on the material. We've learned a good thing, to not be judgmental. And it's true that we should not judge people by their height, their weight, their aptitude, things like that. But you have to make a distinction between judging the person and judging an act. You have to judge the act. In other words, if somebody were to kill somebody or commit an adulterous affair, how on earth would you say, well, that's bad what they did? That's a judgment. So let's pretend, not pretend, but in our minds, let's start orienting ourselves that this whole course is directed towards making judgments, all right? And it's geared towards being discriminating. So you also are thinking, well, we were taught not to discriminate. You're not to discriminate in terms of race, color, and creed. Otherwise, you have to discriminate. Is anybody here planning to go to the prom? Will you discriminate with the person that you choose?
Please pardon this interruption. Would the choir members please report to the auditorium at this time? Thank you.
I hope so. If not, you might as well just stand up here and the next person that walks through the door, guess what? That's who you're going with. Is anybody here planning to go to college? Do you plan to discriminate on what college you choose? If not, then go down to Mr. Ditsky and ask him what index card's on top. You know, in other words, let's be very clear that we have to work through these things, and they're based on principles, they're based on various knowledge that we've inherited, and we can't know it all. So submission to other people in these terms does not mean that you are not thinking for yourself. So I want to be clear, because people will think, I want to be a free thinker, I want to determine things for myself. We don't do that anywhere else, okay? That being said, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the existence of moral good and moral evil. Before we get started to do it, I want to say something about this word I have up on the board, privation. Has anybody ever seen or heard that word before? Nope. Nope. Okay. Privation means it's the absence of something, okay? Now, first of all, some of you are going to go to college, and some of you are going to get a professor in front of you that's going to think he's going to be slick. And he's going to say, who here went to a Catholic school? You went to a Catholic school. Oh, okay. I have a question for you. Do you believe that God created everything that exists? You're going to say yes. Oh, really? Does evil exist in the world? Well, you can't deny that, right? So I guess your good God created evil. And then you're going to sit there thinking, oh man, I just walked into something, right? What's wrong with that argument is the understanding of how evil exists. Evil is not like good. Evil is a privation. It's the absence of good, all right? So it's a very popular analogy to use if I were to say that, like the hole in my shirt, like a buttonhole. The buttonhole is there, right? But it is really the absence of a shirt in that particular spot. So when we talk about moral good and moral evil, we are not talking about equals and opposites like the yin and the yang, all right? Evil is the absence or the privation of good. Now, it's more than that, but at this level, we're going to leave it at that, okay? I want to start you out with a definition of morality. I'll let you write down the beginning of this, and then I'll give you the ending after the ellipse. When you see definitions, you have to work through the word and the language in it, okay? If I were just to leave it like that, do you know how much that would tell you about Catholic moral theology? Look what it says already. It's rational. In other words, I can comprehend and understand it. It's ordered. It's ordered towards a direct end. I mean, there's something out there that we are aiming towards. It's a human act. Guess what? Morality doesn't apply to monkeys and dogs. It just doesn't. This is a human act. And it's an act, which means it's something that's being accomplished, okay? And it's working towards the good in truth. Those things go together, okay? So the rational ordering of the human act to the good in truth and the voluntary pursuit of that truth in reason. And the voluntary pursuit of that truth in reason. So it is the rational ordering of the human act to the good in truth and the voluntary pursuit of that truth in reason. There's a lot there, okay? And we'll unpack that as we go over the course of this. As we go over the weeks of this course. If you could, these are bullet points. If you would list these and leave like a space or two between each of them. I have a short 5-minute video by a philosophy professor from Boston University named Dr. Peter Kreeft. And it's nice and concise. It's not, thorough, but it's not intended to be thorough. It's meant to be, descriptive and informative, and that it is. He's going to show why each of these, if someone considers them to be origins of good, moral good, that they're simply insufficient. They don't work. So rather than you feverishly trying to list those or saying what was it that he said, I'm going to have you list them now, and then as I play the video and he talks about moral good through evolution, reason, and so on, then you can hit it. When we're done, every class has been able to give this back to me, okay? So let's see how good your note-taking skills are. This pretty much will demonstrate, what your future college careers will be like.
What's the very last one?
Utilitarianism, okay? Yeah, UTILITARIAN-ism. And you'll see this. Has anybody ever heard of the man John Stuart Mill? You have, or he has another question?
No.
Anyway, he's responsible for this understanding. Yes.
So we're writing down like the good that comes from each of those?
Well, no, what he's going to say is he's going to say why none of these are sufficient in themselves for determining a moral good. Okay? So they're errors. All right? Okay, let me play it. And then we'll go from there.
I'm going to argue for the existence of God from the premise that moral good and evil.
No idea why we have no sounds. Let me just back it up. Try it again.
Existence of God.
Pardon me. Make sure it's not popped out anywhere. Gotta love technology, right?
They are not simply a matter of personal, not merely substitutes for I like and I don't like. Before I begin, let's get one misunderstanding.
Honest to goodness, we've been using this all day without issue.
You watch Twilight?
What's that?
You watch Twilight?
Can
Can we watch Twilight?
Oh, watch Twilight.
It's his favorite movie.
I've never seen it.
Yeah.
It says it's mine.
No, yours is.
What is it?
Nash.
It's not even a movie.
Oh, bunk.
You believe it.
You will be.
You know what this is? This is a sign.
It's a sign.
It's a sign of
It's a sign of moral goodness.
Yeah.
See, we're being deprived of the sound, so
It's a
That's
privation of sound.
a moral evil.
It's a privation of sound.
I'm going to unplug it and plug it back in here and see if that corrects anything.
The Flash is the real Flash movie is in the 80s.
Brian, there is a Flash movie. It's in the film. Yeah, it's a little movie. Favorite one. Transformers.
Superman?
Okay, guys,
The Avengers?
we'll do this.
Winter Soldier? Dark World? Lord of Dark World?
Naming all the superheroes and villains.
Dark Knight Rises? The Amazing Spider-Man? Second one?
All right.
I don't know. What is it?
For whatever reason, in the last 5 minutes, my audio cord seems to be not working, so let's just, I'm just not going to go over these with you.
Why won't you just read it to us? He's going to.
Well, I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to give you the summation of what he said, so.
How about you not include
Okay. So listen, first of all, with how do you start out with? With evolution. Let's do it this way. This might not be a bad little exercise. Somebody tell me, what is the gist of evolution? Just, what's the gist of it?
It's like natural selection, so as time goes on, all creatures, plants, animals, humans, it's like survival of the fittest.
Okay, so over time, things change, right? Okay, so over time, things change, which means we're not, good. There's an adaptation, I think, is also how you're hitting. So if we're going to apply moral thought to evolution, we're going to have to follow the same conclusion. That if we were just to say that we have evolved in our moral thought, then we're going to have to say that moral truth also changes and adapts. Do you get the problem there? Now, that's the truth of it, but think a little beyond that. What does that mean for us? Now, we sort of feel like we've figured things out, like we are the pinnacle of evolution, and that we've learned what is or is not moral. The people 1,000 years ago were a little more ignorant. Now, the problem with that is the people 1,000 years ago did not consider themselves ignorant. They weren't sitting there thinking, we only know partial truths. Fortunately, in the 21st century, they'll have it all figured out. All right? What does that mean then? That means that 1,000 years from now, they might look back on us like we look back on the Middle Ages. If we find their reasoning and their morality insufficient or deficient, don't you think people are going to look back and see that as us? So do you see, that is not going to be a good way to determine what is or is not moral. Evolution is going to be deficient because just like physical evolution, biological evolution, that there's adaptation and change, so too would be moral evolution, okay? Now, the problem with reason, now he makes 2 points, and I'll put this video up on Canvas so that way somebody can follow it if you'd like. He says, first of all, we need reason to determine what is or is not moral. That's part of the problem. If reason alone determines it, and you need it to make an evaluation, you're kind of using the ruler to measure the ruler. I mean, there's an issue there. But that's not where he stops. So he starts out by saying, first of all, reason is the tool by which we understand what is or is not moral. He goes on to say, aren't many things that we do unreasonable, that are moral? For instance, those Gentiles who hid Jews during World War II, they did it at the risk of their own lives. That's not a reasonable thing to do. For somebody to lay their life down for another person and risk injury, even to like jump into, say, a burning car to rescue a young child that, is as the result of an accident, is not a reasonable thing to do. To put a ring on a young man or a young woman's finger in the next 4 or 5 years and say, you're it for life. On a pure reason analysis, it's not exactly reasonable. So we always do things that are moral that aren't necessarily reasonable. So those are his 2 issues with it. Again, one is, first of all, reason is the vehicle by which we determine whether or not the act is moral. But secondly, a lot of the moral acts that we accomplish or aspire to are not reasonable in themselves. So then he concludes reason alone, not just using reason, but reason alone is going to be insufficient for determining a moral act. Then he says conscience. Does anybody want to venture a guess why conscience might be insufficient for determining what is or is not moral?
Your conscience is like your opinion, I guess.
Well, it varies, right? So let's say that. So you're onto something, right? So your conscience and my conscience might be different, right? So if your conscience is determining morality and my conscience is determining morality, we have an issue, okay? Plus, you have something?
Well, like, like you have to be taught what's right and wrong. So like it's like trying to ask someone who's never taken math to like do calculus.
Yeah, so, okay, she's right. There's a development in conscience, right, and a formation of conscience. So, you know, basically you're saying, well, how do they get formed? So it probably relies on the other things. The other problem is, too, aren't there people, and he used some extreme examples that seem to have no conscience. I mean, they really do, but it's just, it's so dead that for all intents and purposes, they have no conscience. We can speak like that. So what do we do with those people, all right? So here again, we're going to have a real issue because all of us are going to have different conscience. If we say that there's an objective truth, it can only be my truth and your truth. So in other words, maybe you might be talking to somebody who had an adulterous affair, and you're going to make a judgment on that. You're going to say that was bad. And they're going to start to tell you, hey, if it bothers your conscience, fine, but keep it to yourself. Don't judge me. It doesn't bother my conscience. That statement doesn't make any act correct. It doesn't qualify a moral act simply because we affirm it, all right? Okay, human nature. Now, I'm going to use human nature a little different next week.
Please excuse this interruption. Mr. Wenzel, please come to the main office. Mr. Wenzel, please come to the main office.
Other teachers have to be doing the same thing I'm doing, don't they? I mean, I'm not the only one, right? Okay. Human nature. What happened in some of the riots we had recently with like the area of businesses and everything else? What happened when people just kind of like got out of hand? Do you remember? What happened? Come on, it was all through the news.
They were like setting fire and destroyed.
Setting fire, they were pillaging, right? Powerful people always take advantage of the weak, right? Majorities often try to take control over minority populations. The fact of it is that if we were left to our own base human nature, isn't it selfishness, egocentric? All right? So he says two things about this. One is that if we are left to our own devices, we're going to exhibit selfish and egocentric behavior. And then he follows up by saying, isn't it morality that's supposed to regulate human nature? I mean, what makes us different than the animals if it wasn't for moral codes that we could follow? So he says those are the two issues if we try to say that human nature itself is going to be the source of our morality. The last thing he says is utilitarianism, all right? Does anybody know what that is? You want to try?
Isn't it like? Oh wait.
You get close and I'll help you.
I think I'm thinking of the wrong thing.
Okay. It's not something you may not have been taught in here in this school yet. It's the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay? So we're looking for the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So our morality is determined not by a crass popular vote, but what will bring happiness and fulfillment to the greatest number of people. He uses the example of if we have 20 people in a particular environment and it'll satisfy 19 people by using one as a slave, is that not a form of utilitarianism? So let me ask you in this way. If we had a utilitarian approach to, say, immigration in the United States, what do you think would be our attitude towards immigration? The greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. What do you think would be our attitude towards immigration? There's 350 million of us and, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of immigrants each year. Do you think that we would let them impede on our happiness? No. Not unless we saw some utilitarian value to them. Come do the jobs we don't feel like doing. But other than that, we can't have you tax our system because that detracts from the happiness of the greater majority. So we have to work towards the greater happiness from the greater majority. From the greater majority wishes to have the greater happiness. Yes?
For human nature, so it's like you can't get good from it because like if we all kind of make mistakes, then
Well, that's part of it. You know, we have so many weaknesses that are about our nature, you know. Let's just face it. If I were giving an exam and I said, look, I want you guys to keep your eyes on your own paper. I have to leave the room. So just promise me that you're not going to cheat. And I walk out and I just tell you, I'm not going to be back in until the last 2 minutes of class. Does anybody in this room think that cheating is not going to occur? I mean, let's just be honest, right? Why? Because if we're left to our own devices, we're going to be very egocentric and selfish. The only thing, and that's the one aspect that he talks about, but the other aspect is the only way the human nature is regulated is by immorality. So some of you may stand up and say, I'm earning my grade, stop it. You know? And what you're doing is trying to say, look, you know, there's moral laws and understandings that are going to regulate what otherwise would be just egocentric and selfish behavior. Okay, that's where he went with that. Okay, then what else he goes on to say, and this is over at 1245, is that science and math tell us what is. Okay, those things study what is. But morality studies what ought to be. Okay, not in terms of, you know, some pie in the sky, you know, ideal, but it teaches what we ought to do, not what is per se. He then goes on to say that morality is not a physical thing, like those things in math and science, which is why I started out by giving you the 3 different types of abstract sciences. So, if it's not a physical thing, if morality is an immaterial or a spiritual thing, it's above our nature. All right? So anything that's above our nature is going to be a law that has to come from a lawgiver. Okay? So this is the connection he makes. Is that first of all, it is not something material. It's not of nature. It's above our nature. It's supernatural, which means it's outside of us. And by the way, you don't have to be a theist. You can be an atheist and believe in the soul. That is materialism, to say that the only thing that exists is what we can touch, what we can see, what we can weigh. You can be an atheist and make the argument for a spiritual aspect of the person. Okay? So what we're saying here is that there is something above our nature. And then he concludes by saying, if there is a law from outside of us, there must be a lawgiver. And then he makes the argument that in the end, this can point to God. Okay? So sorry for that confusion.